I want to say a little bit about Atisha. In fact, actually, the purpose of hearing about masters is important to think about. That is to say, it's not just hearing about somebody from history. For us, the great masters are in a way our parents, our ancestors, our grandparents at least. In the teachings we practice, and therefore the effectiveness of those teachings is what's come from them. So we are hearing about our kind of almost like genetic Dharma lineage when we hear about the great masters. That's really, really important. And also their life are like exemplary. I mean, perhaps in this life we'll not match their great accomplishments and so on, but it's still we have something to live up to and something to kind of emulate. And also when they meet difficulties in their life and overcome them, it gives us some advice for how we should conduct our life at such times also. So there's many benefits of hearing about the great figures. But the main thing I want to say is, really we should feel that when we're hearing about the great predecessors, it's not from some remote time in history, even though I'm going to tell you in a moment when Atisha was born, but it's like they're still alive, or at least they're just like in the next room to us. That's what we remember when we recite their names in some of our lineage prayers and stuff like that. So I'm going to talk about Atisha, because even though, in Sakya and Kagyu schools, we're not directly, he's not really directly part of us, but in fact, his teachings are coming to those traditions. So they came into all Tibetan Buddhist traditions. So he's a lineage forefather in a way for everybody. And this amazing number of teachings that really did, as I say, come from him. So Atisha was actually born in Bengal, although he spent the last 13 years of his life in Tibet, and therefore that's primarily what he's remembered for. He was actually a very accomplished Indian master, a very famous master in the Buddhism of India at that time. He's born in 979. He seems to have come from some kind of princely family, although I've got to say that in reading about Indian Buddhist gurus, every single one of them seems to have come from a royal family. And so you got to think a little bit of hyperbole has been going on there. And else, where were the ordinary folk? But anyway, that's maybe. So Atisha became a Dharma practitioner. And actually, interesting enough, for somebody who's going to be such a famous abbot, monastic abbot and transmitter of monasticism, for many years he was not. He was a Mahayanist, of course. He was inspired by the Bodhisattva vow. But he also, in his 20s, he was very studious in Vajrayana. He had quite a lot of gurus, particularly one called Kusalipa. He's a very famous Vajrayana master. And then at the age of 30, he had some vision, meditation experience, suppose, in which he saw Shakyamuni. And at that point, he thought, well, I will actually must ordain. So he became ordained at that age and became extraordinarily flawless monk, great hold of the rules and disciplines of monasticism. Just for the record, actually, he belonged to the Mahasangika Sangha, monastic ordination. But having become a monk, then he became a great scholar. So he was versed in all the four major philosophical systems, the tenet systems of the time. Most important, of course, Madhyamaka, the supreme one, the middle way treatise system. And his love for the Mahayana, it's kind of that's really at the center of his life, led him to seek out teachings on how to, as it were, practice the Mahayana as a heart discipline, as a way of transforming the heart. And this led him to the Lojong teachings, the mind training teachings themselves. These upadesha, these oral instructions on Mahayana. They're a separate stream of Mahayana, parallel to the more formal textual transmissions. And so he found three masters in particular in India who could teach him, two in India actually, I should say, one somewhere else, who would teach him the Lojong, Dhammarakshita, Maitri Yogi, and finally, and third and most important, a master called Dhammakirti, who lived in the island of Java. Because in those days, Indonesia was, the Indonesian islands were actually mostly Buddhist, a little bit Hindu, but mostly Buddhist. Of course, that's not the case now, except a little bit remains in Bali. But it was kind of a big Buddhist kingdom in those days. So Atisha went there. He had a very perilous sea trip, actually. There's a whole bunch of stories about that. But he made it and made it back alive. And while he was there, he received the Lojong teachings, particularly in a form that will later be called Lojong Dundumma, 7 points of mind training, from this master Dhammakirti. So that's his life, and up to the age of 60, you know, he's just his meditation practice is progressing. He's practicing this combination of Mahayana and Vajrayana, particularly dedicated to deities like Chenrezig and Tara, and as well as some of the Anuttara deities, and at the center of his spiritual life, the Lojong. Now, at the age of 60, things changed for Atisha, and because at that time, his main deity, his main yidam, as we call it, Tara, makes a prediction to him. It must have been some meditation experience, I guess. Tara appears to him and says, Atisha, you've got to go to Tibet. And, you know, that's the last thing he's thinking of. Tibet has had Buddhism for a couple of 100 years, but actually Buddhism is a little bit of disarray by that time. And Atisha is this incredibly sophisticated scholar, philosopher from India. He doesn't want to go to Tibet. I'm sure he really did not want to go to Tibet, you know, cold, barbarian, beyond the mountains. But Atisha, the Tara tells him, and you have to go, and there will be, you have, your major disciple there will be a layman, a lay follower. So it's all very unlikely. But anyway, he cannot really disobey Tara. And at that time, some people come from Tibet to see him. Because it's late 1030s, and although Dharma has been planted in Tibet starting in the early 7th century, but culminating in the late 8th century with the coming of Padmasambhava, Shantarakshita, and so on, and royal support. By the time of the overthrow of the monarchy in 840, and therefore withdrawal support for the monasteries, the new monasteries, Dharma is in a mess. There's still Dharma. Some of the tantric lineages that Padmasambhava brought are being practiced, but there's a lot of confusion around about what is really to be practiced as Dharma. A lot of kind of strange things have crept in, and overall there's a dislocation, a sense of lack of authority, lack of unity. So the remaining remnants of the old royal family who've gathered in Western Tibet, in Nari, the place of kingdom of Nari, they are dedicated to the Dharma, and they want to find ways of re-strengthening it in Tibet. And one way, of course, is to send young Tibetans that they'll sponsor to go to India to study in the great monasteries in northern India. But another way would be to bring some Indian panditas to Tibet. It's not a great sell, but they're going to try and do that. So they send some people to invite Naxo Lotso, a young Tibetan translator, and a few others go to Atisha. Luckily for them, Tara tells him, yeah, you've got to go to Tibet. So he makes the journey. So he's 60. It's quite a thing, to go at that age to Tibet. But Atisha is such a wonderful, wonderful person. Even his first experience of Tibetan butter tea doesn't throw him. Instead, he applies the Lojong system of taking all things into the path. And his only recorded comment at the time of sipping his first butter tea is, "What nectar is this? It must have been reserved for the gods before." So this and his constantly happy person really endear him to the Tibetans. Because you see, I think it's quite interesting. Atisha in one way is going to come to Tibet and say, you've been getting it wrong. You've made pig's ear, complete mess of this. This is the way you got to do it. So you could see him as he's going to lay down the law. But Atisha is such a gentle bodhisattva, so kind that it worked. And even the proud people who thought they knew something, they would also be just convinced by Atisha's being, his purity of being. So he goes and he settles in Western Tibet in Italy. He's there for 3 years. And one example of this is there were people who are somewhat learned in Dharma in Tibet, when Atisha goes, there's this great guy called Rinchen Zampo, Loswa Rinchen Zampo, translator Rinchen Zampo. He's been in India. He's studied a lot. So he agrees to meet Atisha. But he's kind of proud, despite being very learned and experienced. And so he shows Atisha his temple, and there's all these mandalas of the different tantric deities painted around. And Atisha says, "Oh, that's amazing! That's fantastic! Great!" And he says, "Oh, Lhasa, how do you practice all these?" And he says, "Oh, I practice every one every day separately." And Atisha says, "Oh, Lhasa, I was very impressed, but actually, really, just practice one. It's enough. If you practice one, then you'll get everything." And to do Rinchen Zampo credit, he accepted, and Atisha became his master. So this is the personal warmth of Atisha got the message over. The message of let's, put it together properly. And to do this, his hosts in Western Tibet said, "Can you write a text that will do this, that will show everybody how to practice everything together, how to bring the Shravakayana, the Bodhisattvayana, the Vajrayana into one integrated system," because that's the problem in Tibet. Everybody's taken they touched a little bit of the elephant, so to speak, to use that Buddhist metaphor, and said, this is the whole of Buddhism. And therefore all these crazy things are creeping in. Let's restore that integrity to the Dharma. And so Atisha did. He wrote a text called The Lamp of the Path of Enlightenment, which does exactly this. Right at the beginning, what Atisha does is formulate the graduated path for the three persons, as he calls it, which is in a way, acknowledge that people have different levels of aptitude and motivation, the three persons. So there's a path for the inferior person. Inferior person, as Atisha says, not socially inferior, but just who has the least kind of serious, not least, the mildest or weakest of the motivations is to achieve happiness in this life and next. That's it. There's a path for them. They can practice something. So Atisha says, give the initial teachings on making merit and virtue and so on. That will lead to happiness. For the medium person does know that this is samsara and that even temporary happinesses are finally only temporary. So for he or she, such a person, him or her, they need the path of cultivating renunciation by thinking of the four thoughts: precious human birth, impermanence, karma, and suffering. And that will speed them on the path to their own liberation from suffering. So that's good. And then, but for the great person is one who sees suffering in their own lives, sees what it comes from, but realizes it's affecting everybody else too. Everybody else is affected by suffering, just like me. So I cannot just privilege me and my needs. I must practice for all. And as I must enter the Bodhisattva path, the Mahayana path. That's the path of the great person. And you see here, the thing is, even for the great person, they need also the qualities from the previous two. So in one way, this is like giving something for everybody who's interested at all in Dharma, and that's wonderful. And many people will only want the first. But some people will want the second, and some people want even the third. But the practices that are there for the preceding two levels also form the foundation for the Mahayana. You need to practice virtue. You need to cultivate renunciation. So you need those things. So that is the beginning of the Lamrim, the graduated path system, introduced by Atisha in the Lamp of the Path. And from there he goes on to detail the Bodhisattva vow, how to generate bodhicitta, make the Bodhisattva vow, and how the common Mahayana path is really an accumulation of merit and wisdom, culminating in meditating on shamatha, calm abiding, and vipassana. And through that, as he says, you will enter the paths, the 5 paths and the 10 levels that culminate in Buddhahood in the future. But if you want to achieve this quickly and with ease, then enter into the Vajrayana. And he doesn't, in the root text, give much explicit instruction, because of course that must be given in initiation, but he tells us that that's what the Vajrayana is for accomplishing the mundane accomplishments which make your path speed up, like pacifying and and increasing and so on, there's 4 karmas, and the achievement of Buddhahood. And he says, with this, then the Buddhahood will be gained with ease and swiftly. So it's a very short work, only a dozen or so pages, but it's incredibly fertile because it is now given a sane spine, as it were, mixing metaphors terribly, a sane basis, but a spine too, for Dharma in Tibet, because everybody can now adopt this system and therefore bring everything together. There's a place for monasticism for those who want it. There's a place for Vajrayana. The one person can practice all if they have this map that is provided, use this map that is provided by Atisha and the lamp of the path of enlightenment. And not only will then, the sect that came from Atisha's own direct followers, the Kadam, they will write many commentaries on it, but even in the other traditions, in the Kaju, the great Gampopa will essentially write an extension of this, combine it with some other teachings, called the Jewel Ornament. In Sakya Pandita will write Tubigongsa, elucidating the thought of the sage, again, inspired by Atisha's root text. And there'll be also direct commentaries on Atisha's text, including one by the great Rimé master, Jamgon Kongtrul. So Atisha's achieved a lot by the lamp of the path of enlightenment. And he's preparing to return to India because he doesn't see himself, living the rest of his life in Tibet. He wants to go back to India to his monastic duties and so on and so forth. Perhaps some decent food, but that's another matter. The histories are silent on that point. One can only imagine. But then this guy called Dromten Jalwa Junni, comes from central Tibet and says, please come. There are many people who'd like to hear the teachings in central Tibet. There's an interesting Dharma, but there's a lot of confusion. Please come to central Tibet. And of course, Atisha, realizes this is the person that Tara had mentioned in her prediction. Dromten is the person. So he accepts this. And Dromten then becomes known as kind of major. There are other great disciples around Atisha, like Naxo Lotsoa and Nok Lotsoa and so on. But Dromten is his closest disciple, one could say. So he goes to central Tibet and then spends the last 10 years of his life in central Tibet. What does he do? Well, he teaches Lamp of the Path of Enlightenment. He teaches classical Indian Mahayana texts, like the great Madhyamaka treatises. He teaches Asanga's texts, like Bodhisattva Bhumi. He gives tantric initiations, because the early Kadam have many tantric deities. Although sometimes people mistakenly think Atisha was against the Vajrayana. Not at all. He was a Vajrayana master and gave many tantric teachings. It's just he wanted everybody to understand how Vajrayana is an integrated part of the whole of the Dharma. So Atisha gave many teachings, particularly like the 4 Kadam deities, as we call them, Shakyamuni, Green Tara, Chenrezi, and Achala. And he gives the Lojong teachings, these very precious essential teachings on Mahayana, generation Bodhicitta, that he received from Dhammakirti and his other 2 Lojong masters. He gives them in privately, without writing down, he gives them to Dromten. But they will become like so precious jewels of the early Kadamba. So 3 main lineages arise out of Atisha's activities in that 10 years, in that 13 years as a whole, in Tibet. What we call the lineage of the Shung, the lineage of the textual presentations, so the classical Indian Mahayana works, the Lojong, or the Damnak lineage, the lineage of the, of the mind training instructions, and then the Menak, the lineage of the tantric instructions, like the 4 Kadam deities that I just mentioned. These 3 lineages will be the inheritance of the early Kadampas from Atisha's work in Tibet. And then later on, they'll flow into all the other traditions, become part of the general inheritance of all Tibetan Buddhism. But at all times, Atisha's sweetness of personality and kindness and kind-heartedness was what won the Tibetans to him, because he's not just a scholar, and he's not just talking to would-be scholars. He talks to the ordinary people as well, and he stresses the fundamentals again and again. Like some people simply called him the refuge guru, because that's what he talked about for most people, the importance of taking refuge. And he was always approachable because of this kindness. The Tibetans kept remarking about that. He never lost his smile. He never lost his gentleness and his loving kindness for people. There's one story, for instance, with Dromten, that one time Atisha had, I think, a sore head and a headache maybe. And he said to Dromten, just put your arm there, just put your hand there. And you, because you have developed some loving kindness, your loving kindness will be enough blessing to take that away. So it really, Atisha is a heart master. His teachings come straight from the heart. And that is why he's, so beloved, not just as an authority figure in getting the Dharma straight, but as an embodiment of what we can become by practicing the Dharma. So all of us look back to Atisha as this extraordinary figure whose blessings are still present in our practice.